He entered his own luxury dealership disguised as a nobody and was laughed at, disrespected, and thrown out like trash. What the staff didn't know was that the poor stranger they humiliated was Chuck Norris, the owner of the entire company. What happened next changed everything. Subscribe, drop a like, and comment what city you're watching from. The morning sun was only beginning to slip between the tall windows of Chuck Norris's study when he opened the folder that had been waiting on his desk since the night before. The room was quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if the walls themselves understood that what he was about to read demanded silence. The desk, immaculate as always, held only the folder, a cooling cup of black coffee, and his old leather-bound notebook, an object that had followed him through decades of victories, failures, and reinventions. Chuck took a slow breath, opened the first page of complaints, and began to read. They were not the usual criticisms that any large business receives. A misplaced receipt, a delayed delivery, a rude clerk on a bad day. These were different. They were stories, short, sharp, and painful. A construction worker turned away because his boots were dirty enough to scratch the tile floors. A mother with 2 children ignored for almost 30 minutes while salesmen hovered over wealthier visitors. A disabled veteran who asked for help and was told, "Cars like these aren't for pensions." Each message carried the same sting beneath different details: humiliation, mockery, dismissal. He kept reading, and the words began to echo in him, not as noise but as anger. No matter how far he had come in life, Chuck had never been a stranger to being underestimated. He remembered what it felt like to walk into rooms where people decided your worth in the first 2 seconds. He remembered being a young martial artist with a patched uniform and no reputation. He remembered buying his first car piece by piece from a junkyard because new parts were out of reach. The difference was that he had never forgotten where he came from. But somewhere inside his company, someone else had. He turned the page and found one complaint marked with a red tab. His assistant, Linda, had left a handwritten note on it. This one might matter more than the others. The story was simple and almost painful in how familiar it felt. A man in work clothes had entered one of the Norris auto showrooms asking about a used truck. Before he said 10 words, the manager laughed, asked if he had even checked the price tags, and offered to call him a taxi. Back to the neighborhood where trucks like that still count as luxury. The man had left in silence, but someone else in the showroom, a stranger, had recorded the entire moment and posted it online. The video had passed through thousands of hands before finally landing on Chuck's desk. He set the papers down and stared ahead. Not at the wall, but somewhere farther into the years behind him. He had built this company from nothing, not by selling machines, but by selling trust. The first showroom he opened had been a single garage with 3 used cars, and he had washed each one himself because he believed that anything done with respect held value. What he saw now was not just a customer treated poorly, it was a betrayal of something foundational. The knock on the door was soft, almost reluctant. Linda stepped inside with a tablet tucked against her chest. "I see you started reading," she said gently. She was one of the few people who could speak to him without hesitation, but even she seemed careful today. Chuck nodded. "How many in total?" 27 formal complaints in the last 3 months, she replied. "But if you count the online reports, messages, and silent walkouts, several hundred." "Silent walkouts," Chuck repeated, as if trying the phrase out. "People left without ever being spoken to?" "Not people," she said quietly. "People who didn't look rich enough." He leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked, the only sound in the room. "Is that what we've become? A brand that greets wallets instead of faces?" Linda hesitated, then answered truthfully. "In some locations, yes." The door opened again, this time with more certainty. His corporate attorney, Cameron Holt, walked in holding a digital briefcase. "I've reviewed the submitted complaints," Cameron began, already in legal mode. "We can open an internal investigation discreetly and handle this from a structural level. We don't have to escalate publicly." Chuck didn't look at him right away. He turned another page instead, a printout of the video. In the still frame, the worker stood with his hands in his pockets, trying to keep dignity while 2 men laughed at him like he was entertainment. Chuck finally raised his eyes. "If I investigate as the owner, everyone will perform, he said. They'll smile. They'll rehearse respect like a script. I don't need them to act polite for me. I need to see who they really are when they think no one is watching. Cameron exhaled, knowing exactly what Chuck meant and exactly what it implied. You're planning to go in person, undercover. That's the only way to get the truth, Chuck replied. Linda looked at him with concern. Then you'll need to look like someone they wouldn't try to impress. Chuck's expression shifted, not into a smile, but into something much quieter and more dangerous. Resolve. He stood, walked toward a storage cabinet, and opened a drawer that hadn't been touched in years. Inside lay a set of clothes from another lifetime, a jacket faded with oil stains, a pair of jeans softened by years of work, heavy boots that once walked through dust, gravel, and rain. His fingertips brushed the fabric, and for a moment he wasn't a brand, a corporation, or a legend. He was just a man who used to stand under a car lift with grease on his hands and loud music fighting the silence. That's the Chuck they need to meet, he said, not the one they've seen on magazine covers. Linda watched him with a look that was part respect, part fear. You know this won't be like one of your films, she reminded him quietly. No stunts, no choreography. People can be cruel when they think someone is beneath them. Yes, he answered, and that's exactly why I need to go. He folded the clothes over his arm, then paused. Tell me something, Linda. When was the last time I went anywhere without a driver? She blinked. I don't think you have in at least 10 years. Good, wah, he said. Then it's time to remember how to wait for a bus again. Later, standing in front of a mirror, he dressed himself in the past. The fabric felt heavier than suits, not physically, but with the weight of memory. He smeared a faint streak of dust across one sleeve, scuffed the boots against the concrete, and ran a hand through his hair to unsettle the polished image the world had grown used to. He left his watch on the dresser. He put his phone in the inside pocket, screen off, in case of emergency. And when he stepped outside the door, for the first time in years, no one opened it for him. Outside, the morning air tasted real like city dust, like the metallic tang of rails, like the quiet sigh of people trying to get somewhere. He walked to the old tram stop, feeling the rhythm of footsteps and crosswalks instead of tinted windows and chauffeurs. When the tram arrived, he boarded silently and took a spot near the window. Nobody recognized him. Nobody even looked twice. A man in worn clothes was invisible. As the tram clattered through the city, Chuck watched life move beside him. A teenager studying a textbook, a woman balancing grocery bags, an old man staring at nothing and everything at once. No one was trying to sell anything. No one was performing. People were simply existing, honestly, imperfectly, humanly. And in that moment, he felt a strange ache for something his own business had lost. The route turned and the skyline shifted. The glass and steel facade of one of his own showrooms glittered in the sun like a jewel. The gold logo on its entrance gleamed with the promise of prestige. From a distance, it looked untouchable, powerful. But Chuck now knew that inside, something had rotted not in the structure, but in the spirit. The tram slowed. He stepped off, tightening the strap of the old canvas bag hanging from his shoulder. Inside it was only one thing, a reminder of why he built all this in the first place. The worn mechanic's badge with his name on it. The one badge that had earned respect, not because of money, not because of power, but because of effort. He walked slowly toward the showroom doors, blending into the stream of early customers and pedestrians. No security guard opened the door for him. No one paused to greet him. To them, he was just another man who couldn't possibly afford to be here. Exactly what he needed. And with that, he stepped inside. The story of what happened to him there would change the company forever. And it was only beginning. The glass doors of the showroom parted without the slightest acknowledgement of the man who walked through them. Chuck stepped inside slowly, letting the warmth and polished scent of the interior wash over him. The place looked exactly as he had always intended it to look. Spotless marble floors, perfectly aligned vehicles, soft ambient music, and the subtle fragrance that hinted at luxury without shouting it. But the beauty of the room only made the contrast sharper as he looked around and realized not a single employee had even glanced in his direction. He stood still for a moment, allowing the scene to breathe around him. Two salesmen stood by a row of high-end cars, laughing quietly about something on one of their phones. A receptionist tapped lazily on her keyboard, glancing up only when a couple walked in behind him, dressed in tailored coats and expensive shoes. Her smile bloomed instantly warm, bright, intentional. A greeting that came alive only for those who appeared to deserve it. Chuck watched as the couple responded politely, receiving immediate service, while he remained invisible, as if air had shaped itself into a man no one needed to acknowledge. He approached the nearest employee, a young salesman with sharp hair, perfect posture, and a smirk that seemed permanent. "Excuse me," Chuck said calmly. "Can I ask about that model?" He pointed to a sleek silver SUV in the corner. The salesman didn't even look at where Chuck was pointing. He gave a slow, up-and-down stare, the kind that didn't land on a person, but on their clothes, shoes, and the imagined number in their bank account. "That one," he said, finally glancing at the SUV with feigned reluctance. "Sir, that's part of our executive line. It starts at a price range that usually requires—" He let the sentence hang, allowing the insult to form itself. A different kind of client. Chuck didn't flinch. He merely breathed in, letting the moment settle instead of reacting to it. The salesman was not interested in helping him. He wanted to make sure Chuck knew he didn't belong. "Could I still take a look at it?" Chuck asked, as if unaware of the mockery. The salesman scoffed under his breath and waved toward the car, as if granting a child permission to touch a forbidden object. "Sure, as long as you don't scratch it. Repairs on that thing cost more than whatever you're wearing." A couple nearby chuckled. A quiet, polite laughter meant only to be heard by those already in on the joke. Chuck walked past them, keeping his steps measured and unbroken. He ran a hand gently along the smooth surface of the SUV. The vehicle was a masterpiece, precision and craft embodied in metal. Yet at this moment, even the car felt tainted by the ugliness that surrounded it. What use was the gleam of chrome if the people presenting it had lost their humanity? Before he could step back, another voice entered the scene, a louder, more commanding one. "Hey!" The word cracked through the room. It belonged to a man in an expensive suit, perfectly fitted, hair set immaculately in place. His name tag read, Archie Blake, General Manager. Archie walked toward him with a swagger that didn't come from confidence, but from the unchecked power of someone who had never been challenged. His eyes scanned Chuck with the same practiced contempt the first salesman had shown, but sharper, more deliberate. "You looking to buy that?" Archie asked, not out of curiosity, but out of mockery. "Or are you just here to get a selfie with something you'll never afford?" A few employees snickered. One of them muttered, "Probably wandered in from the street." Another added, "Check his shoe. Looks like they haven't seen a polish since the last decade." Chuck remained still. His silence only provoked Archie more. "We keep this place clean," Archie continued, stepping closer. "So unless you're planning on signing something other than air, I suggest you go admire cars somewhere that fits your budget. Maybe the used lot down the highway? They've got some nice pieces from the previous century. Should feel like home." He said it loudly, making sure everyone in the room heard it, not to shame Chuck privately, but to make a spectacle of him. Chuck's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in the quiet restraint of a man who knew exactly what was happening and why it mattered. "I just asked a question about the car," Chuck replied steadily. "And I just answered you," Archie shot back. "Now, unless you're going to pull a stack of bills out of those cheap pockets, you're done here. Try not to breathe on the leather while you walk out." "Nay, one." Then came the moment Chuck had been waiting for, not because he wanted it, but because it exposed everything. Archie stepped forward, pushed him lightly at first as though herding a stray dog back toward the door. But when Chuck didn't move, didn't cower, didn't apologize for daring to exist, the push became something else, a sudden, sharp kick to the back of his leg. Chuck staggered forward but kept his balance. Several customers gasped. One laughed. Not a single employee intervened. A young trainee, a boy barely 20, took a hesitant step forward as if to speak, but Archie glanced toward him with a glare that froze him in place. "You don't talk to him," Archie snapped. "He's learning his place, and so should you." Chuck straightened slowly, his breathing calm, his eyes steady. Archie mistook that calm for weakness. "You know what?" the manager said loudly, pulling his phone from his pocket. I think you're looking for trouble. I think you came in here planning to make a scene, so I'm calling the police. Chuck watched him dial, watched the smirk pull across his face, watched him use the word aggressive male and attempted theft while staring straight into Chuck's eyes as if daring him to object. They'll be here in 5 minutes, Archie said, snapping his phone shut. By then, you'll be outside, face down, where you belong. Chuck said nothing, not because he was afraid, but because the truth needed space to reveal itself fully. If the rot had reached the police, he needed to see that too. The showroom doors opened again. 2 police officers stepped inside with familiarity, not with authority, but with friendship. Archie greeted them with a handshake and a grin, like a man calling in reinforcements he owned. That's him, Archie said, pointing at Chuck. Tried getting into one of the cars, then got hostile. The officers didn't look at the car. They didn't ask a question. They didn't request proof. They walked straight toward Chuck like they already knew what they were going to say. And when one of them smirked, the same way Archie had smirked, Chuck understood exactly what kind of world he had just walked into, and what was required to break it. The moment before they spoke stretched in slow silence, like a bowstring drawn tight. The humiliation wasn't finished yet, but neither was the story. The 2 officers approached with the casual confidence of men who already believed the outcome had been decided. Their uniforms were crisp, but their posture was sloppy with entitlement. They didn't look at the showroom, the security cameras, or the car Chuck had supposedly tried to steal. They looked only at him, the way a wolf looks at something it has already decided is prey. You the one causing problems? The taller officer asked, his voice thick with performance rather than inquiry. His badge read Hank Muller. The second officer, Ridge Pearson, folded his arms and smirked, as if the very idea of innocence were entertaining. I asked a question about a car, Chuck replied evenly. That was the extent of my interaction here, until you started getting physical, Hank interrupted, without letting him finish. We've already heard the report. Chuck studied him. You heard a version of events. Hey, Ridge said, taking a step forward. We don't need smart remarks. We know what happened. Do you? Chuck asked, his tone still steady, still calm. Or are you just repeating whatever your friend over there told you? The room shifted. Several customers were watching now, not interfering, not speaking, just witnessing. Some with discomfort, some with morbid curiosity, but none brave enough to step between a man in old clothes and 2 uniforms. Hank walked behind Chuck and gave a sharp shove between the shoulder blades, not enough to knock him down, just enough to make clear that power was the point, not justice. You've got 2 choices, Hank said. Walk out on your own or we drag you out. Either way, you're done here. And if I refuse, Chuck asked, then you're getting charged, Ridge answered casually. Trespassing, attempted theft, obstruction, whatever's easiest. And you'll back all that up in court? Chuck asked, still without raising his voice. The pause that followed wasn't hesitation. It was annoyance, because they weren't used to pushback. Oh, we won't need court, Hank said. All we need is a report. Judge trusts us more than a man who looks like he sleeps behind a gas station. Archie laughed loudly from across the room, proud of the spectacle he had created. See? I told you this clown thought he could talk his way out of it. Chuck didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the officers. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. And you're doing it in front of cameras. Ridge rolled his eyes. We already know the camera angle doesn't reach this side of the floor. Chuck didn't need to turn around to know the officers were right. The nearest visible camera was angled toward the main sales area, not the entrance hall where they stood. A perfect blind spot for quiet intimidation. A perfect feature, not a flaw. That was the moment Chuck knew he wasn't dealing with ignorance. He was dealing with a partnership. And then Archie stepped forward again, this time not with words but with movement. He reached out, grabbed a fistful of Chuck's jacket, and hissed low enough for only the officers and Chuck to hear. Last chance. Walk out or get thrown out. The grip tightened. The shove came next. A second, harder kick to the back of Chuck's leg, delivered with the kind of confidence only a man abusing protection could ever wield. The officers didn't react. They approved of it. That was enough. Chuck straightened slowly, almost gracefully, as if the pain mattered less than the principle. "I warned you," he said, not as a threat, as a fact. Archie scoffed. "What are you going to do? Swing at a cop?" "Go ahead. Give me the final reason to bury you." He swung, just not the way he expected. Chuck didn't punch him. He didn't even strike him. He moved. One fluid motion, a sidestep, a wrist catch, a grip shift, and a controlled twist that dropped Archie flat onto the polished floor before the crowd even gasped. The manager's arm was pinned, not broken, but locked in a way that told him, in a language deeper than words, that resisting would only end worse. No one in the showroom had ever seen something move that fast except in films. But this was not a movie. There were no dramatic kicks, no spinning theatrics. Just skill, discipline, precision. Ridge reached for his baton, Hank reached for his cuffs, but neither acted quickly enough, because Chuck had already released Archie and stepped back. Hands open to show he was not attacking, only defending. "I did not touch any of you until I was assaulted repeatedly," he said, his voice now resonating through the room. "And I will defend myself again if necessary. But I am not the criminal here." For the first time, something flickered across the officers' faces. Not fear, not guilt, but uncertainty. They had just watched a man in old clothes move with the control of someone who had trained his entire life to protect, not harm. And now the customers were no longer silent. A murmur was spreading across the room. Whispers. Someone at the back raised a phone and began recording. Then another. Then a third. Chuck turned his head slightly, not to speak to the officers, not to speak to Archie still groaning on the floor, but to address the entire room. "You all saw what happened," he said, his voice still level, still unshaken. "You saw how I was treated the moment I walked in. You saw who escalated this. You saw who put hands on me. If anyone wants to lie about it later, remember that the truth doesn't vanish just because someone powerful wants it to." The silence inside the showroom was different now. No longer scripted, no longer filtered through fear of authority. It was the kind of silence that meant the balance of the moment had shifted. And then Chuck did something none of them expected. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the same jacket that the manager had mocked, the same one that had been shoved and kicked, and he pulled out a small black identification card. He held it up between two fingers. A corporate badge. Not the badge of a customer, not the badge of an employee, the badge of the owner. "My name," he said, "is Chuck Norris, and this showroom belongs to me." The words did not explode. They detonated. Faces went pale. Phones stopped midair. The officers froze. Archie, still on the floor, blinked in disbelief as if he were waking from a nightmare that had somehow become real. Chuck lowered the badge. "We're not finished," he told them. "Not even close." But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because the shift of power was now complete, and the consequences had only begun. For a long moment, no one in the showroom moved. The silence was no longer the kind that followed tension, but the kind that followed revelation. The badge still rested between Chuck's fingers, small and simple, but it had shifted the entire atmosphere of the room more effectively than any threat or raised voice ever could. The two officers stared at him, their confidence evaporating almost visibly, as if the authority stitched onto their uniforms had begun peeling away thread by thread. Archie, still on the floor, blinked up at the man he thought he had humiliated, his face drained of even the color anger usually brought him. He opened his mouth, searching for a way to reverse the scene, to rewrite the last few minutes, to say he had misunderstood, but there was no path left for him to escape through. Chuck finally lowered the badge and slipped it back into his pocket with the same calm precision he had used to restrain the manager moments earlier. Then he turned not toward the officers, not toward the crowd, but toward the receptionist at the front desk. "Call the regional director," he said evenly. "Tell him I'm here and that I want the security footage pulled immediately." The receptionist stared at him, wide-eyed, unsure whether to obey the man she had ignored just minutes before. She looked toward Archie instinctively, but the sight of the manager still on the floor provided no reassurance. She nodded shakily and moved to the phone. Chuck then addressed the officers. You came here on a false report, he said. You intimidated an innocent person without verifying a single detail. You allowed physical assault to occur in your presence and participated in verbal harassment. That's not law enforcement. That's collusion. Officer Hank swallowed. Look, you acted because he told you to. Chuck finished for him, nodding toward Archie. Which means you weren't here to enforce the law. You were here to enforce a relationship. Ridge tried a different angle. We didn't know who you were. That's the problem, Chuck replied. You thought my identity changed whether or not I deserve respect. That tells me everything I need to know about how you treat people who don't have power. The doors at the far end opened again, and this time it wasn't police. It was a pair of men in dark suits, badges at their belts, sharp eyes scanning the room. The security division from corporate headquarters. They moved straight toward Chuck, offering him a subtle nod of acknowledgement. We were told you wanted internal footage pulled, the first one said. I want the recordings from every camera in the showroom, Chuck confirmed, particularly the angles near the entrance and the sales floor. And I want the audio logs from the security desk for all customer incidents in the past year. The second agent gestured toward the back office. We'll start now. Archie finally found his voice, though it came out more like a gasp than a statement. You can't just walk in here and... Chuck turned slowly, not with the speed of confrontation, but with the weight of authority. I built this company, he said. Every desk, every logo, every car on this floor exists because I put my name and life into the business behind it. And somewhere along the way, people like you turned it into a place where worth was measured by appearance instead of character. Archie opened his mouth again, but the words still refused to form into anything useful. His face crumpled into something between desperation and disbelief, like a man who had stepped confidently into a trap and only now realized it wasn't his trap. From the far side of the room, a voice spoke quiet but clear. He's telling the truth. It was the trainee, the young man who had hesitated earlier, who had watched the humiliation without knowing how to intervene, who had carried the weight of discomfort in his body long before Chuck ever entered the building. Now he stepped forward, voice steadier with every word. I've seen it more than once. Customers who didn't look rich were pushed out, told there weren't any models in their price range. Calls to police were used to scare people off. It wasn't just today. It's been happening for months. All eyes shifted to him, but he didn't retreat. If anything, speaking seemed to pull something upright inside him, like a spine unbent after too long. Chuck didn't interrupt. He didn't move. He let the young man speak. And he wasn't the first one they kicked, the trainee continued. Last week, a delivery driver asked to use the restroom. They laughed at him and called security to escort him out. A woman came in with her son and wanted to ask about financing. Archie said, "We don't do charity here," and sent her away before she even sat down. Archie flared at that. You little rat. But the trainee didn't back down. You said people like them lower the brand. I think you're the one who lowered it. A ripple went through the room. Not applause, not noise, but recognition. The soundless shift that happens when truth leaves one person and lands in many. Chuck finally spoke again. What's your name? Emil, the trainee replied. Emil Carter. Thank you, Emil, Chuck said. Your honesty will be remembered. Then he turned toward the officers who seemed to be shrinking by the minute. Until further notice, he said, you are not permitted to remove, detain, or threaten anyone in this building. Any attempt to interfere with the internal investigation will be documented and forwarded to the state attorney's office. Hank widened his eyes. You're filing charges? I'm filing the truth, Chuck corrected. Whatever it earns you is not my decision, it's yours. Security escorts stepped closer, not to protect Chuck, but to make sure the officers did not try to leave before they were questioned. The entire room felt different now, not heavy with mockery, but heavy with consequence. Chuck looked once more at the showroom he had created. The shining cars, the spotless glass, the spotless floors. On the surface, nothing had changed, but now he had seen what lived underneath the polish. Not excellence, but rot. Not pride, but cruelty disguised as professionalism. And now that it had been exposed, it could finally be cut out. He let out a slow breath and said to the corporate agents, "Lock the warehouse, freeze the payroll accounts of every senior manager, and pull the purchase orders on high-value replacement parts for the last 6 months. I want a full audit." One agent nodded and stepped away to begin. The other paused. "Are we treating this as internal misconduct or criminal investigation?" Chuck looked at Archie, the officers, then the employees who had stood silent out of fear or habit. "We're treating it as whatever the evidence proves it to be." Then he added with quiet finality, "And we're just getting started." The next phase of justice was already forming, piece by piece, like gears beginning to turn. The unmasking was complete. Now came the reckoning. The hours that followed were not loud, not dramatic, not filled with shouting or chaos. Instead, they unfolded with a quiet precision that was far more unsettling to those who had built their power on noise, intimidation, and unchecked authority. Chuck remained in the building, not as a customer, not as a stranger, but as the man reclaiming what had been taken from him long before he ever walked through the door in worn jeans and old boots. What had been stolen was not money, not merchandise, not even reputation, but the soul of the company he had built. The corporate security team worked with a speed that suggested this was not the first time they had been called in to clean a contaminated room. They requested access to the back offices, the purchase archives, the camera feeds, and the storage logs. No one dared refuse, not now. The monitors in the conference room flickered to life one by one, recordings, timestamps, access logs, shipment signatures. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows. It was appearing file by file, like dust being shaken from a long-carpeted floor. Chuck took his place at the head of the conference table, though he never raised his voice or demanded attention. He simply watched, observed, listened. He knew that what was being uncovered was not a single incident of cruelty or a single day of misconduct. Those were only symptoms. The disease went deeper. The financial analyst arrived next, a woman named Marin who carried a tablet, a stack of printouts, and the expression of someone who trusted numbers more than excuses. She greeted Chuck with respect and then began laying out documents on the table. "This," she said, pointing to a row of transactions, "is where it starts." The invoices looked normal at first glance. Routine orders for auto parts, inventory restock, supply replacements, but each entry carried the same signature: non-standard item codes, vague descriptions, repeated supplier names that did not match any approved vendor list, and an unusual frequency of urgent replacement orders that bypassed standard approval channels. And more importantly, every one of those irregular orders had been signed by the same name: Archie Blake. "What were the parts?" Chuck asked. "High-value engine components, rare trim pieces, imported brake kits," Marin replied. "The kind of parts that can be resold for 300% markup on the aftermarket. The totals aren't massive in single transactions, but added together," she tapped the screen. The number appeared. A 6-figure loss. Chuck allowed himself only one slow breath. "And the receiving records?" he asked. "Adjusted," she answered. "The parts were marked as received and installed, but the vehicle service logs show no matching repairs. They were never used. They were redirected." "To where?" "We're tracking that now," the auditor said, stepping forward. He was an older man with silver hair and a voice that sounded like it had spent decades under fluorescent lights, listening to lies dissolve in front of him. "So far, 3 shell companies, all set up with different names, but they share a mailing address registered to a co-working space downtown." "Who owns them?" Chuck asked. "We've traced the accounts," the auditor said. "None are in Archie's name, but 2 are in the name of a woman he shares a mortgage with. The 3rd is in the name of one of the officers who responded today." There was no outburst of disbelief, no denial, just the slow, heavy realization that the rot was not limited to a single man or a single building, but had grown roots into places where power was supposed to protect, not exploit. Chuck nodded once. "Continue." The auditor opened a folder and slid forward a sheet of paper printouts of call logs. Dozens of calls between Archie and Officer Hank. Dozens more between the officer and the warehouse entry desk. A pattern emerged. Every time a shipment arrived, there was a call. Every time an inspection was scheduled, there was a warning. It wasn't sloppiness, it was a system. A quiet knock interrupted the meeting. Emil, the trainee, entered with hesitation, holding a folder to his chest. I found this, he said. In the break room. It was taped behind a cabinet. He set it down in front of Chuck. Inside were printed emails messages between Archie and several employees. They weren't threats. They didn't need to be. They were instructions disguised as company culture. Don't waste time on customers who clearly can't buy. Trust me, if they can't dress the part, they can't pay the part. Police know we deal with sketchy types. Don't hesitate to call. Keep the good clients away from the optics of low-budget walk-ins. And remember, branding matters. We are a luxury space. The arrogance wasn't hidden, it was documented. Chuck read each line slowly. Not because he doubted what they meant, but because every word was a reminder of how far the company had drifted from the man who founded it. Thank you, Emil, he said. You made the right choice. Emil nodded, though it was clear his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from relief. For the first time, he wasn't silent. For the first time, speaking had done something. As he stepped back, the head of security approached Chuck with a tablet. There's something else you need to see her, he said. The video began playing on the conference screen. Not from today, not from this showroom. A recording from 3 months earlier in a different location. A customer asking about a used sedan. A salesman mocking his accent. A manager telling him financing wasn't for people like him. And then security escorting the man out. Not because he had caused trouble, but because the staff didn't want him near serious buyers. That customer hadn't filed a complaint. He had simply left. Chuck leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped. This is not just a theft problem, he said. It's a culture problem. One of the security agents spoke cautiously. We can terminate all involved immediately. No, Chuck said. Not yet. The room looked at him, confused. Chuck continued. If I fire them now, they will claim unfair dismissal. They will say this was personal. I don't want opinions. I want irrefutable evidence. And I want it recorded, documented, and sealed before anyone walks out of this building. The auditor nodded. So you want a full legal case built? I want no one walking away claiming they didn't know why they were held accountable, Chuck said. I want every lie confronted by a fact. Every signature matched to theft. Every insult weighed against proof. When they face consequences, it will be because they earned them. There was no anger in his voice. There was something far more unsettling, certainty. What about the officers? Marin asked. They'll be dealt with, Chuck said. Police investigate police, but the public sees everything eventually. Then he added almost softly, and they should. As the meeting continued, the final piece of the puzzle arrived. One of the analysts burst into the room holding a laptop. The missing shipment, he said breathlessly. We found it, listed on an auction site, being sold under a reseller profile tied to one of Archie's shell companies. The listing went up this morning. Chuck stood slowly. Print everything, store backups remotely, and send copies directly to corporate legal. The analyst nodded and hurried out. The room settled into motion again, pages turning, files opening, numbers aligning into patterns that no longer hid. Chuck looked through the glass wall into the showroom. The cars still gleamed under the lights. The space was as polished as ever, but he no longer saw what was on display. He saw what had been concealed, and for the first time in a long time, the next step felt clear. The wrongdoing had been exposed. Now it would be judged, not by him alone, but by the law, the company, and the same public that had once trusted his name. Tomorrow would not be the punishment. Tomorrow would be the rebuild. But tonight, the guilty would finally understand something they had forgotten. You can steal parts. You can steal money. You can even steal dignity. But you cannot steal the truth forever. It always arrives, and it always arrives with a price. By the time the sun rose over the city the next morning, the machinery of accountability was already in motion. Legal notices had been drafted, the stolen inventory traced, the police officers reported to internal affairs, and the fraudulent accounts frozen. The company, once unaware of the sickness growing beneath its surface, was now awake and beginning the painful but necessary process of healing. But for Chuck, punishment had never been the end goal. Accountability was only the foundation. What mattered even more was what would be built upon it. A business could recover from lost money. It could recover from damaged reputation. But it could not recover from the loss of its soul unless someone was willing to restore what had been forgotten. 3 months later, everything looked the same, and yet nothing felt the same. The showroom was still polished, the cars still gleaming beneath perfect lighting, but the atmosphere inside no longer carried the brittle sharpness of selective respect. The employees who remained stood not straighter, but softer, more alert, more attentive, more human. It was not fear that shaped their behavior now. It was awareness. A group of new hires gathered near the reception desk, listening to a young woman leading them through orientation. Her name was Emma Lawson, the very same trainee who had once been ignored in staff meetings, dismissed as too idealistic, and told to focus on selling, not caring. But she was not a trainee anymore. She stood with confidence, not because authority had been handed to her, but because she had earned it the moment she chose honesty over comfort. When a customer walks in, Emma said to the group, you don't evaluate their shoes, their clothes, their posture, or how much you think they can spend. You evaluate one thing, what they need. That's the only filter that matters here. The new hires nodded. She continued, you'll meet people who can buy a car in cash and people who are financing their very first vehicle. You'll meet people who speak quietly and people who don't know the right vocabulary and people who are nervous because they've never been treated with respect in a place like this. Your job is not to judge who they are. Your job is to show them who we are. Behind the glass wall of the training room, Chuck watched in silence. It was not the words that moved him, but the fact that they were being spoken by someone who had once been invisible in her own workplace. Someone the company had almost lost because the culture had once cared more about polish than substance. Now she was shaping future employees. Now she was the culture. He stepped away as the room applauded, letting the moment belong to her. The sales floor was alive with small, quiet examples of change. A single mother test driving a sedan with her daughter in the back seat, both treated with the same courtesy as a man in a suit signing for a luxury model. A teenager with a summer job asking about saving plans and receiving real financial guidance instead of a dismissive glance. A retired mechanic comparing engine specs with a consultant who listened as if learning from him, not selling to him. No one looked rushed. No one looked rehearsed. The smiles were no longer performances, they were earned. Chuck moved through the space like a visitor, unnoticed by most, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Respect did not depend on his presence anymore. It existed now, even in his absence. That was the true test of culture, not how people behaved when watched, but how they behaved when no one was keeping score. Near the entrance, a young man walked in wearing a faded jacket, nervously clutching a small folder of paperwork. He hesitated, unsure whether to approach the desk. A consultant spotted him, crossed the room, and offered a simple, genuine greeting. Welcome. What can I help you with today? The man relaxed just a little, because he had been expected, not judged. That small moment, more than any policy, told Chuck the transformation was real. He stepped outside into the cool afternoon air and looked up at the golden logo on the building's facade. It had once reflected success. That was no longer enough. Now it needed to reflect integrity. He reached into his pocket and felt the worn edges of something he carried with him, often now. Not his company badge, not his phone, but the old mechanic's ID card he had worn in his earliest years. The card was frayed, bent, smudged with time, but it was honest. It reminded him that dignity had never belonged to the powerful, it belonged to the decent. A voice spoke behind him. Sir? It was Emil, the trainee from months earlier, now confident, steady, and wearing a proper nameplate. I just wanted to say, Emil paused, searching for the right words. Thank you for not firing me when I didn't speak up fast enough that day. Chuck turned to him, studying him with the kind of attention that made people feel seen instead of examined. You didn't stay silent forever, Chuck said, and sometimes that's the hardest part. Emil nodded. smiling with a sincerity that didn't need approval. I didn't want to lose my job. And you didn't, Chuck replied. But now you know which jobs are worth keeping. They exchanged a quiet understanding, the kind that didn't need more words. As Emil walked back inside, Chuck faced the building once more. The company was not perfect. It would make mistakes again. People would fail and systems would weaken, and new problems would eventually take the place of old ones. But now there was a principle embedded in its foundation, stronger than marble, more valuable than chrome. Respect is not a service. It is a standard. And it was no longer negotiable. In the end, the business had never been about cars. Cars were metal, engines, paint replaceable. What mattered was how people felt when they walked through the door, and how they felt when they walked out again. Real success, he understood now, wasn't measured by how many luxury vehicles rolled off the lot. It was measured by how many human beings left standing taller than when they arrived. He took one last look at the showroom, then turned away with the quiet confidence of a man who had restored not just a company, but its purpose. Justice had been delivered, but something greater had been built. And that, in the end, was the real victory. Before you scroll away, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Drop a like, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and check out the other videos on the channel. Every one of them has its own twist.